It began on an unusually cold Tuesday morning in March 2024, when Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the receiving dock of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. As curator of the Civil War photographic collection for 12 years, she had processed thousands of artifacts, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes. Cartes de visite each a window into America's most violent and complicated era. But the small package handed to her that morning immediately felt different. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to her in neat block letters, with no return address, no phone number, and no email. Inside was a brief typed note from someone who chose to remain anonymous. This photograph has been in my possession for 30 years. I inherited it from an estate sale in Charleston. Some things are not what they appear. Please examine it carefully. The truth matters more than my name. Curiosity tightened in Sarah's chest as she removed the photograph from its wrapping. It was a carte de visite from 1863, remarkably well preserved, mounted on the proper paper stock of the Civil War era. The image showed two women posed in a formal studio setting. On the left stood a white woman in her late 20s, dressed in an opulent silk gown, posture confident, expression composed, clearly a woman of wealth and authority. On the right stood a younger black woman, dressed plainly, her hair wrapped, hands clasped properly in front of her, her gaze lowered in trained submission. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, was written, Carolyn Ashford and her girl Rachel. Charleston, South Carolina. March 1863. Sarah had seen dozens of such photographs, propaganda. Portraits meant to present slavery as gentle, domestic, even harmonious, but something about this one unsettled her more deeply than usual. The anonymous donor's warning echoed in her mind. Some things are not what they appear. She placed the photograph under archival lighting and reached for her loupe. At first glance, everything about the image appeared authentic. The studio backdrop, the printing technique, the aging of the cardstock, but as she studied the faces, something tugged at her instincts. Not a flaw, not damage. Something else, something she could not yet name, but felt she had seen before. Her pulse quickened with the familiar sensation of a hidden truth waiting to surface. She picked up her phone and called her colleague, Dr. James Warren, a forensic photography expert. James, can you come to my office? I think I need a second opinion. Give me 10 minutes, he replied. While waiting, Sarah leaned closer to the image. The white woman Carolyn held herself with polished grace. The black woman Rachel held herself with quiet tension, her clasped hands positioned almost deliberately. Sarah sensed a story beneath the stage calm of the portrait. A performance? A secret. The donor had known something, and whatever it was hidden in plain sight. As she set the photograph aside and prepared her digital scanner for high-resolution imaging, she whispered to herself the words that had ignited her curiosity from the moment. She opened the box. Some things are not what they appear. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on Sarah's office door. Dr. James Warren stepped in carrying his portable digital microscope and laptop. The tools that had helped them authenticate countless Civil War photographs. He was calm and methodical as always, the kind of person who understood that truth in archives rarely arrived dramatically. It emerged slowly, detail by detail. What do we have? He asked, setting up his equipment on the workstation. Sarah handed him the photograph and the anonymous note. 1863, carte de visite from Charleston. Plantation, mistress and her enslaved domestic. Standard propaganda pose. But the donor told me to examine it carefully and said things aren't what they appear. James studied the image with her loupe first, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he positioned the photograph under his digital microscope, connecting it to his laptop. The image appeared on the screen, crisp and enlarged. He opened his facial analysis software and began marking key reference points on the white woman's face, Carolyn Ashford. The distance between the eyes, the width of the nose, the line of the jaw, the angle of the cheekbones, the shape of the ears. Next, he moved to the black woman Rachel. He marked the same points again, this time more slowly. As the software overlaid the measurements and generated comparison lines, the similarities began to sharpen into something undeniable. The interocular distance is nearly identical. James said quietly, face width to length ratio, almost the same. Look at the jawline. And the ear's placement relative to the eyes, that's strongly genetic. Sarah felt her heartbeat slip into a faster rhythm. She leaned closer to the screen, watching as the software's overlay made the two faces blur into one another. They were clearly not identical, but they were too similar to ignore. Familial relationship? She asked, already knowing the answer. Almost certainly, James replied. Sisters are likely? Possibly half-sisters. The degree of similarity in this many features doesn't happen at random. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Sarah had spent her career studying slavery, and she knew exactly what this implication meant in the world of the antebellum South. A white plantation woman and a black enslaved woman sharing a father. It was a familiar horror. White men owning plantations had routinely raped enslaved women. The children born from that violence were enslaved alongside their mothers, treated as property, sometimes living in the same house as their white half-siblings while being denied their names, their inheritance, their humanity. If they're sisters, Sarah said slowly, then Rachel is most likely the daughter of Caroline's father, James finished, and he enslaved his own child. Silence settled over the room as both of them stared at the photograph differently now. The staged portrait was no longer just propaganda. It was potentially evidence of something far more specific and damning. A woman standing beside her enslaved half-sister, posing as mistress and servant while sharing the same blood. We need documentation, James said at last. Facial analysis gives a strong probability. But we'll need records, plantation ledgers, tax inventories, family papers, anything that links these names. Sarah turned to her computer and began searching historical databases. The surname Ashford surfaced immediately in Charleston records, a well-known plantation family. Within minutes she found him, Robert Ashford, born 1798, owner of Ashford Grove Plantation. Roughly 3,000 acres worked by over 200 enslaved people. A wealthy rice planter, politically influential, a staunch defender of slavery. Here, Sarah said. Robert Ashford. One legitimate daughter, Caroline, born 1834. She married a man named Thomas Petton in 1856. Widowed in 1862, returned to her father's plantation after his death. That puts her exactly where the photograph places her back at Ashford Grove in 1863. James nodded. So Caroline's age, status, and location match. Any siblings? Not officially, Sarah replied. She's listed as an only child. They didn't need to say out loud what officially meant in that context. For a man like Robert Ashford, only legitimate white children counted in family registers. Any children born to enslaved women would be invisible in public records, recorded, if at all. Only as property dot, they requested digitized plantation documents from South Carolina, archives, and began wading through ledgers and tax records. The language of ownership was cold and mechanical. Names, approximate ages, assigned labor, assessed value. Then, in 1850 inventory, Sarah found the first piece of the puzzle she had been hoping for. Here, she said. House servant named Sarah, age 23. She scrolled further down. The enslaved were often grouped by family when it suited the owner's bookkeeping. Under Sarah's name was a notation. One child, female, age 3. Named Rachel. If Rachel was 3 in 1850, Sarah calculated, she'd be around 16 or 17 in 1863, younger than she looks in the photograph. But ages for enslaved people were often estimated. Exactly, James agreed. Births weren't always recorded precisely. Hard labor, malnutrition, trauma, those things can make people appear older than their years. They traced further through subsequent inventories. Rachel appeared again in 1855 and 1860, listed as Sarah's daughter, assigned to housework each time kept inside the household, not sent to the fields. Then, In a 1855 clothing ledger, they found the note that hit like a punch next to Rachel's name. After the usual listing of clothing ration, someone had written in the margin, "Give extra fabric this year." Master's orders. Girl looks like family. Keep her in house away from visitors. Sarah stared at the screen, speechless for a moment. They knew, she finally whispered. They saw it. They recognized how much she resembled them. And they were worried visitors would recognize it too, James said, his voice grim. So they hid her in plain sight. She could serve them, but she couldn't be seen too closely. The record showed more than just ownership now. They reeled anxiety, guilt, and awareness of a crime that had to be concealed. Robert Ashford had not only raped an enslaved woman named Sarah, he had then tried to control and bury the evidence of that violence by hiding their daughter. Sarah kept scrolling until she found another entry in 1860 inventory, the same clinical list of human beings as taxable assets. Under the familiar name Sarah, age 33, house servant, there was a brief note, deceased September 1860. No cause, no explanation. Just a single word to close a life. So Rachel loses her mother at 13, Sarah said quietly. She's left alone in that house, enslaved by her own father and her half-sister, with no one to protect her. The photograph on the table suddenly felt like a trap that Rachel had been forced to stand inside. A white mistress and her girl, the caption said. But behind the ink and behind the pose, the truth was darker and infinitely more complicated. The anonymous donor had been right. Some things were not what they appeared. And now, Sarah knew they had only uncovered the beginning of what this photograph was hiding for the next several days. Sarah and James worked with relentless focus, moving between digitized archives, plantation records, census logs, and diaries. With each new discovery, the photograph began to transform from a staged artifact into a layered testimony of abuse, secrecy, and survival. Every detail they uncovered formed another piece of a narrative that had been buried for more than a century. The turning point came on a quiet Thursday evening when Sarah returned to the high-resolution scan she had captured earlier. She enlarged the image inch by inch, slowly examining textures, shadows, and edges. At normal size, Rachel's hands appeared respectfully folded in the customary pose of an enslaved domestic. But when magnified to the scan's highest resolution, a faint, irregular shape appeared between her palms, barely visible, almost invisible in the original print. Sarah's breath caught. She adjusted the brightness, tweaked contrast, and used forensic enhancement filters. The pixels sharpened, shadows receded. And then, as if stepping forward from 1863, the truth appeared. Rachel was holding something. Something small. Something folded. Something she had deliberately concealed in her hands the day the portrait was taken. "James," she called, her voice tight with disbelief. "I need you to see this." He joined her at the monitor. The enhanced image showed the unmistakable corner of folded paper 2 inches at most, carefully hidden between Rachel's interlaced fingers. With further enhancement, faint lines of handwriting became visible, though not yet legible. But the significance was immediately clear. She was hiding something during the photograph, James said slowly. Something she didn't want Carolyn or the photographer to see. And the anonymous donor must have known, Sarah added. That's why they wrote, "Some things are not what they appear." They had seen this. The realization sent a shiver through her. What would Rachel have been desperate enough to hide during a staged propaganda portrait? What truth could be small enough to fold, precious enough to risk discovery, and dangerous enough to conceal in the one moment she was forced to stand frozen beside her half-sister? The only answer was something written. They spent the next 2 days trying to decipher the microscopic writing from the scan. But the resolution, even as advanced as it was, could not fully reveal the content. The fragment was simply too small, too folded, too obscured by Rachel's hands frozen in time that Sarah remembered the donor's note. "Please examine it carefully. If the donor knew about the hidden paper, then they might also have it." That possibility became the driving question. Whoever had purchased the Ashford Petton estate lot in 1994-50, years before the donor sent the photograph, must have sorted through the documents and found the folded square. So Sarah began searching for estate sale records from Charleston in 1994. It took days of calls, coordination with the Charleston Historical Society, and cross-referencing auction reports. But finally she found it, the estate liquidation of Margaret Petton Thornton, the final direct descendant of Carolyn Ashford. The catalog listed miscellaneous historical documents and photographs. Various dates, sold as one lot. "That's our box," James said. "The donor bought that lot, and the hidden paper must have been inside." Now they had only one mission. Find the donor. Sarah posted careful messages on genealogy forums, local history pages, and academic listservs, seeking anyone who had purchased items from the Thornton estate in 1994. She made no mention of the photograph's content, only its provenance. Days passed. Nothing. Until one Monday morning when an email arrived from an anonymous temporary account with no traceable identifiers. "Dr. Mitchell, I am the person who sent you the photograph. I purchased the documents from the 1994 sale. I have been waiting decades for someone capable of interpreting their significance. With the last of the Petton descendants now deceased, I believe it is finally safe for the truth to be revealed. I have the other materials, including the paper Rachel held in the photograph. If you wish to see them, I can arrange a meeting in Charleston. I prefer to remain anonymous for personal reasons, but will provide everything to you. Reply if interested." Sarah read the message 3 times, her pulse pounding. The paper Rachel held for the camera held as if it were her only protection in a world that denied her. Identity still existed. She looked at James. "We have to go." He nodded. "We're not just studying a photograph anymore. We're uncovering a buried testimony." Sarah replied immediately and received a swift response. Saturday, 2 p.m., Charleston Archives and History Center. A private room. A box would be delivered. The donor would not stay. The final line chilled her. The truth about Rachel is more extraordinary than you yet realize. 4 days later, they were on a plane to Charleston. Neither of them slept that night. At exactly 2 p.m. on Saturday, a staff member knocked on the private research room door and handed Sarah a cardboard box. The person who delivered it had already vanished. Inside the box were 4 items, wrapped in archival tissue: a leather-bound diary labeled Carolyn Ashford Petton, 1862 to 1867, a bundle of letters tied with string, a Plantation Bible with handwritten birth and death entries, and wrapped in multiple layers, a tiny folded piece of brittle yellow paper. The label on the last item read, "This is what Rachel was holding. Read it first." Sarah unfolded it slowly, breath trembling. The paper was small enough to hide in a pair of clasped hands. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were clear. "I, Robert Ashford, do hereby acknowledge that Rachel, daughter of Sarah, is my natural daughter. God forgive me for the evil I have done. April 7th, 1863. Robert Ashford." Sarah and James stared at the paper in stunned silence. It was not just evidence. It was a confession, a father's signature, a truth Rachel had carried in secret, a truth hidden inside the portrait that had been staged to erase. Her. The photograph was no longer a mystery. It was witness. The room felt impossibly still as Sarah and James absorbed the meaning of the small confession note. It was fragile, no larger than a palm, yet it carried the weight of a buried crime, a truth Rachel had held literally in her hands the day she stood beside her half-sister, forced to pose as property. The paper trembled slightly in Sarah's fingers as she set it gently on the archival mapboard. "Let's see what else is in the box," James said quietly, though his voice carried the stunned softness of someone standing at the edge of history. Sarah reached for the first item, the cracked leather-bound diary labeled Carolyn Ashford Petton, 1862 to 1867. The pages were brittle, but intact. Written in looping, elegant handwriting, Several entries were marked with red tabs by the donor, likely the ones most relevant. She opened to the first marked page. Dated March 10th, 1863. The ink was faded, but Caroline's voice felt disturbingly alive. Father is dying. The doctor says his heart will not last the year. He has grown melancholy, speaking constantly of sins and judgment. This morning he asked to see the girl Rachel in his study for nearly an hour. When she came out, her face was strange eyes, bright, yet full of something I cannot name. Father refused to tell me what passed between them, saying only that he had made his peace with something long troubling him. Sarah and James exchanged a glance. This entry matched perfectly with the confession note dated April. Whatever happened in that study had changed. Rachel forever. The next marked entry was more shocking. Dated April 10th, 1863. Caroline's handwriting trembled on the page as if she had struggled to write it. Father told me a truth that has unsettled everything I believed of my life. He confessed that Rachel is his daughter, my sister. Her mother, Sarah, was, I cannot bring myself to write the word. He says he has written the fact in his own hand and given the paper to Rachel as proof, asking her forgiveness. I am horrified. The girl I have ordered about as a servant is my own blood. Sarah felt a cold pressure form in her chest as she read. Caroline wrote of horror and sin, but nowhere did she acknowledge Rachel's humanity. Nowhere did she express remorse for the years she had treated her sister as a maid. James leaned over her shoulder. She knew. She knew for decades. Sarah nodded, and still didn't free her. The diary continued, revealing a mind tangled in prejudice and guilt. In June 1863, Caroline wrote, I asked Rachel today if she still possesses Father's paper. She said yes. I asked where she keeps it. She would not tell me. I was angry, but then I understood even if she is my sister, she is still what she is. And I suppose she has reason not to trust me. Father died last month. That paper is all she has of him. The more they read, the clearer it became. Caroline lived her life with two truths locked inside her. The official truth of a wealthy white daughter and the hidden truth of a sister she called maid. Next, they examined the bundle of letters tied with string. One, dated April 1863, was addressed to Caroline's cousin, Anne Middleton. It confirmed everything. Father has confessed that Rachel, the servant girl, is his daughter. I am in despair. I cannot free her. This scandal would destroy us. But how do I command her as before, knowing what I know? She has Father's written acknowledgement. I fear what might happen if it were ever discovered. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. The cruelty wasn't loud. It was quiet, polite, socially acceptable. That made it worse that they moved to the Plantation Bible next. Births and deaths were meticulously recorded in the elegant, self-important handwriting of white privilege. But at the bottom of the family page, squeezed into a tight margin, written in a different hand, strong but uneven, were the words that made Sarah's breath catch. Rachel, daughter of Robert Ashford and Sarah, born 1847, sister to Caroline. And beneath it, a final note. This entry was made by me, Rachel Ashford. On December 20th, 1865, before I departed this place forever. One, add my name to this record because I am family whether acknowledge. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Rachel had carved her truth into the one book the Ashford family would preserve and pass down. She had made herself unforgettable. She wrote herself into the family. James whispered. She claimed her own name. No one could erase her anymore, Sarah said softly. The last document they opened was another diary entry. Dated December 28th, 1865, 3 years after the photograph. Rachel has left us. She walked away 3 days ago and has not returned. I suppose she waited until the war was won, until the Emancipation Amendment was certain. I should be angry, yet I find I am relieved. Her presence reminded me constantly of Father's sin and my own cowardice. Perhaps now I can forget. The words made Sarah's stomach twist. Forgetting was a luxury only the oppressor could claim. She closed the diary slowly. Rachel hadn't been forgotten. She had documented herself. She had carried her father's confession. She had written her name in the family Bible. She had walked away when freedom became law, and she had left the Ashford family with a truth they would spend generations trying to bury. "We're not done," Sarah said, emotion tightening her voice. "We need to know what happened to her after she left." James nodded. "If she lived into Reconstruction, there should be a trail. Freedmen's Bureau records, census entries, marriages. She didn't vanish. Someone like her wouldn't vanish." Sarah looked at the small confession paper again. The handwriting trembled with guilt, the signature shaky. The words damning. "God forgive me for the evil I have done." Now, more than a century later, Sarah realized that Rachel had kept that confession because she knew something no one else had believed at the time. One day, the truth would matter. And today was that day. The next phase of Sarah and James's work shifted from uncovering the past hidden in Charleston to tracing the future. Rachel had carved for herself after freedom. The documents in the donor's box had painted a complete picture of Rachel's life until 1865, after she wrote her name in the Ashford family Bible and walked away from the plantation. Her story vanished from the South. Sarah refused to believe that was the end. If she lived until adulthood, Sarah said, scrolling through digitized databases, there has to be a record somewhere. Freed people didn't disappear. They moved, worked, voted, married, built families. And Rachel was literate, James added, pointing to her confident handwriting in the family Bible. That's rare for someone enslaved. It means she likely valued education. People like her often joined black churches, schools, community groups. There should be a trace. For 3 days, the two researchers dug through archives. They searched Freedmen's Bureau labor contracts, post-Civil War school records, black church membership lists, 1870 and 1880 federal census logs, and dozens of city directories. At first, nothing appeared. Rachel had been one of thousands who fled the South after emancipation, many taking new surnames or using first names only. Every dead end tightened the urgency, Sarah felt. "We're missing something," she murmured. Something she would carry with her. Something she would never give up. James looked toward the small confession note resting inside its protective sleeve. "She kept her father's last name," he said. "Ashford." She signed it in the Bible. She claimed it. That means she might have used it later. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. She searched again, this time filtering for black women named Rachel. Ashford in the northern states. And then there it was, a census record from Philadelphia. 1870. Name, Rachel Ashford. Age, 23. Race, black. Occupation, seamstress. Literacy, yes. Place of birth, South Carolina. Household, boarding with other freed women. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. She knew instantly it was her. She made it, Sarah whispered. She escaped the estate, crossed states, and started her life as herself. James leaned forward, scanning the document. She kept her father's name. She claimed the identity they denied her. That's powerful. But the census was only the beginning. They followed her forward through time. In the 1872 Philadelphia marriage ledger, they found Rachel Ashford marries. Joseph Freeman, a Union Army veteran, and carpenter. Then came their children. Robert Freeman, born 1873, likely named for her father. Sarah Freeman, born 1876, after her mother. Carolyn Freeman, born 1879, after her sister. A gesture that suggested forgiveness or at least acceptance of the complicated bond between them. She named a daughter Carolyn, James said softly, after everything. That tells us something. It tells us Rachel understood the difference between the system and the individuals trapped inside it, Sarah replied. She didn't forget, but she didn't carry bitterness until her last breath either. They found more records, city directories listing her as a seamstress, then later as a teacher in a black community school. Church registries showing her involvement in women's aid circles. Her children's school records. Her husband's obituary. Her own death certificate dated 1912, listing her parents as Robert Ashford and Sarah. She told the truth to the end, Sarah whispered. Even when no one believed her. Even when no one could prove it. And now, James added. We can. The final step was to find her descendants, using genealogy tools and tracing her children. Through the 1900 and 1910 census records, they located 2 living descendants. James Freeman, retired teacher in Baltimore, Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson. Physician in Atlanta, Sarah drafted 2 careful emails, attaching nothing emotional, only a request to discuss newly uncovered historical materials that might relate to their ancestry. The responses came quickly. Both descendants agreed to meet on video calls. Their reactions were intensely emotional. James Freeman said quietly, "My grandmother used to tell us Rachel's story. She said we were descended from a woman enslaved by her own father. We thought it was family folklore. Now I know it was true." Patricia's voice cracked as she said, "She fought so hard to write herself into history." And she succeeded, even if it took 150 years for anyone to see it. The next challenge was the Ashford-Petton white descendants. Tracing Caroline's line through marriage and inheritance led to Elizabeth Petton Harrison, attorney in Charleston. Michael Petton, business consultant in Virginia. Elizabeth rejected Sarah's outreach immediately, calling the research slanderous fantasy. She accused Sarah of trying to destroy a respectable Southern legacy. But Michael responded differently. He told Sarah, voice low with discomfort, "I always knew something was wrong in our family's history. My grandmother once mentioned a secret my great-great-great-grandmother begged her never to write down. I think this is it, and I'm ready to know the truth." Both families, black and white, agreed to participate in DNA testing. Weeks later, the results came in. Rachel and Carolyn were half-sisters, sharing the same father with 99.9% certainty that it was irrefutable. The bloodline connected them. Science had confirmed what Rachel had held secretly in her hands in 1863. Sarah closed her laptop slowly, overwhelmed. The hidden truth buried behind a falsified portrait. The truth Rachel carried in a folded square of paper had finally come out. She never let them erase her, Sarah murmured. Never. Now the world will know, James replied, and they both understood. A photograph meant to glorify slavery had instead become the definitive evidence of a crime. The Ashford family spent generations hiding. Rachel had turned her silence into testimony. 4 months after Sarah first opened the anonymous package, the investigation reached its final and most public stage. Every document had been authenticated. Every historical trail had been verified. Every descendant, black and white, had been located. And now, the story that had remained hidden for 161 years was ready to step into the light. The National Archives held a press conference in Washington, D.C., its auditorium filled with journalists, historians, genealogists, museum curators, and social justice organizations. At the center of the display stood the 1863 photograph, once just a quiet piece of plantation propaganda, now revealed as one of the most important pieces of evidence ever, uncovered about the realities of slavery. Beside, it were blown-up images of the forensic facial, overlays showing Rachel and Caroline's genetic similarity. Next to that, encased in protective glass, lay the tiny folded confession note Rachel had hidden in her clasped hands the day the picture was taken. Caroline's diary entries, the 1863 letter to her cousin. The Plantation Bible with Rachel's handwritten claim to family all were displayed side by side, forming a narrative so complete it was impossible to deny. Sarah stepped to the podium. Her voice was steady, but her heartbeat thundered with the weight of the moment. Today, she said, we present the full story of Rachel Ashford, a woman enslaved by her own father, photographed beside her half-sister, and forced into silence. But she refused to be erased. She documented herself. She preserved truth, and she ensured that one day someone would listen. She explained how Rachel had secretly held the confession note in her hands during the photograph, how the Ashford family had worked to hide her existence, how Rachel had escaped, rebuilt her life, and told her descendants the truth even when the world refused to believe her. When Sarah finished speaking, A long, stunned silence filled the room before the first wave of questions crashed in. Cameras flashed. Reporters pushed forward. Major national outlets covered the story. Within hours, it spread across social media and then across the world. For the Ashford Petton White descendants, the story shattered generations of polished family myth. Elizabeth Petton Harrison, who had initially denied everything, eventually issued a public statement after the DNA results were released. We cannot undo the sins of our ancestors, but we can acknowledge them. We can face the truth with courage instead of fear. I offer my deepest apology to Rachel's descendants for the suffering inflicted on their family. Her brother Michael attended the press conference in person, standing near the exhibit with red eyes and trembling hands. He approached Rachel's descendants and introduced himself. The meeting was private, emotional, and heavy, but it happened. History turned to corner dot James Freeman, Rachel's great-great-grandson, placed his hand on the glass case containing the confession. My grandmother always said Rachel held on to proof, he said softly. Now the world sees it. Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson added, Rachel's voice was stolen in life. But she wrote her truth down, hid it, protected it, and now finally it speaks. The Smithsonian announced a permanent exhibit dedicated to Rachel Taggart. Hidden in plain sight, the testimony of Rachel Ashford. The photograph that once symbolized a lie now stood as a monument to a woman's quiet defiance. Museum visitors who looked at the portrait no longer saw a plantation mistress and her contented servant. They saw two sisters, one free and one enslaved, separated by a system built to hide their connection. And they saw Rachel's hands carefully clasped not in submission, but in protection of the one piece of truth she refused to let the world bury. The impact was immediate. Universities updated textbooks. Historians cited the case in discussions of enslaved family structures. Civil rights organizations used it to educate about generational trauma. Visitors wept in front of Rachel's exhibit. Teachers brought classrooms to see it. The story traveled far beyond Charleston and Washington. It became a global reminder that suppressed truths do not disappear. They endure. They wait in the weeks that followed. Sarah returned often to the exhibit, standing quietly among visitors as they examined the documents she had rescued from obscurity. She found herself drawn most often to the small confession note, the tiny piece of paper whose survival felt almost miraculous every time she looked at it. She imagined Rachel in that photography studio in 1863, a young woman enslaved by her own father, her mother dead, her identity denied, her sister standing beside her unaware, and yet Rachel had held her truth tightly, literally within her hands, determined to carry it into the future. On one visit, Sarah whispered to the class, "You did it. They see you now." Rachel had won not in her lifetime, but in the one that followed, her truth had survived the plantation, the auction block, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and 161 years of silence. It had survived because she had written it down, because she had hidden it, because she had trusted someone someday to find it, and Sarah had been that someone. Sometimes history is not found. It reveals itself when it's ready, and when it does, it changes everything.